Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here again at the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. I'm Romans 918, and tonight we'll be going through the 11th session of the Herman Bavinck reading group. The 11th session. And it's great to have you here for that. Tonight we'll be looking at one of the most fascinating, intriguing, and even arguably one of the most villainous philosophers in history. And that is, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche. I hope you enjoy. Perfect. So let's get started here. I've got a bunch of slides, a lot of material, and heaps of controversy. So I am going to ask for your prayers this night that I would be able to come through it unscathed. But first, let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together, this fellowship of saints. Lord God, thank you for your loving kindness to us and how you've poured your Spirit out upon us in victory and in love and in goodness. Lord, please guide my words tonight. Let me speak honorable. Let me speak honest and true. Let me speak, Lord, well in the face of a very controversial figure from a controversial time, Lord God. And I pray that everything that is said here would be honoring to you. Thank you for my friends, Lord. I pray for their blessing. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. And let's just go to Psalm 131, Psalm 131 for just a really brief reading. I'll read it very shortly here, but it's just a very near and dear psalm. Psalm 131. My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me, but I have calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child. I am content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. Amen. So thank you for joining. That psalm is near and dear to me. We will be focusing on Friedrich Nietzsche and his role in the Enlightenment, and it's a substantial one. So let's just start off here. First slide. Resources. Um, Obviously, we've talked about Bavinck's Dogmatics and his volume one. There's so much meat in here in these chapters and in these parts. The Cambridge History of 19th Century Philosophy, a great resource for Enlightenment goodies and details. The Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics um, has contributed to helped me understand Nietzsche much better, and I'm very grateful for that. That's Norman Geisler's work. And then finally, I wanted to reference one of Nietzsche's works. There are many to choose from, but I chose the Antichrist by Nietzsche, and for reasons that will hopefully become apparent in the session here. Next slide. And for videos, these are such, I've just put a few, the three videos that have helped me the best with an introductory understanding of Nietzsche. And I hope they're a blessing to you. And they are um, well worth the time. I think each of them is maybe between 13, 15, 18 minutes or so long. And just beautiful introductions to a complex and complicated figure, and a figure who deserves to be treated with some subtlety and some nuance, while at the same time making some very pointed and harsh statements. So I hope I can do that well here. Next slide. We want to talk about Nietzsche as sort of the antithesis of much of classical or pre-Enlightenment thought, and in particular Christianity. So, in some sense, Nietzsche is an anti systematician, for example. So, he will affirm particular truths or local truths or contextual or perspectival truth. However, he will reject universal truths or narratives or objective values or subject independent uh, right and wrong. And we'll talk more about that. So, from his perspective, intellectual inquiry is always perspectival and it's never objective. So, there's never sort of truth for its own sake. And in some sense, Nietzsche is perhaps um, fully committed to the turn to the phenomenological, meaning that he's minimized or eliminated perhaps the noumenal aspects of reality from his philosophy. So, in his mind, he believes that human knowledge, such as it is therefore utilitarian and ultimately leads into self generation of truth and narrative. That's a polite way or a kind way of saying it is the job of the individual to find his own truth, find his own self, to generate his own existence. And so we see that manifest, or I see that manifest sometimes from folks who will say to me something to the effect of, I don't know ultimate truth, and you don't either. Okay, let's try the next slide here. Now, in the work that we cited, from Nietzsche, the Antichrist. H.L. Mencken was the translator of this work into English. Well, he translated, I should say, a version into English. And from his preface describing the book, he gives us very helpful statements into the character and personality and overriding arching themes that drove and dominated Nietzsche in his writings and his thought. So, this is from his preface. Mencken says, it must be made manifest that Nietzsche, in this book, The Antichrist, intended to attack Christianity headlong and with all arms, that for all his rapid writing, he put the utmost care into it. He wanted it to be printed exactly as it stands. In me, he once said, the Christianity of my forebears reaches its logical conclusion. In me, the stern intellectual conscience that Christianity fosters and makes paramount turns against Christianity. In me, Christianity devours itself. So, next slide. With quotes like this, we can see from the start that Nietzsche is positioning his philosophy as a devouring antithesis of Christianity. He is, in fact, welcoming the title of Antichrist. There's no overstatement for Christians like myself, Christian critics like myself, to accuse him of this as if I'm I'm overdoing it or stepping beyond healthy boundaries of criticism. This is, in fact, what he himself has taken upon himself. And so it's not wrong to point that out, even though it is one of the most profane and harshest and strictest and sternest steps a philosopher in the Western world could possibly take. And I apologize for starting with some conclusions here. You know, we normally and typically enjoy the journey together and like to analyze our philosophers and try to perhaps come to the similar conclusions rather than have somebody say up front what we're supposed to think about this thinker. However, I have to put this out here um, because I'm going to be so generous in exploring Nietzsche's thought on charitable terms in so many other ways that I really have to take care up front to make it clear that there is, in my opinion, ultimately no synthesizing step between what Christ calls the kingdom of God and Nietzsche's philosophy. There's no there's no way to integrate into a harmonious and unified whole the two of them. And I apologize for laying that out ahead of time, but we're going to talk in such faithful ways about what he said that I wanted to state that very clearly up front so as to perhaps not be accused later of actually promoting his thought and his philosophy. So, what is the role of Nietzsche for the average lay Christian? What is the role Nietzsche plays for the philosophizing, there we go, Christian theologian and apologist? And I think those are slightly two different questions. So, I would say for the average lay Christian, Nietzsche is probably not appropriate for most settings. He's probably going to be too confusing, and his ultimate antagonism makes him about as good a guide for the things of God as um, it would be to ask the Democratic nominee for president to manage the campaign of the Republican nominee. It's just not going to work. Now, having said that, the Christian theologian, the apologist, the pastor, I think should definitely interact with Nietzsche to some degree and to have some facility in understanding his thought, if and only because of how often his thought will sort of come into conflict. More than any Enlightenment thinker, except perhaps Kant or Marx, Nietzsche is very likely to be the theologian one impacts. I apologize. Nietzsche, the philosopher, Nietzsche is likely to um, face off with in the battlefield. So when you're talking with non-believers or interacting with people uh, contemporarily, um, the spirit of Nietzsche will be one of the most common spirits you will have to deal with and overcome. And professional believers, to use a blunt term, should have some facility and some awareness to be able to handle that. Next slide. Now let's go back to Mencken talking about Nietzsche. And this is not me going overboard and making too much of Nietzsche's hatred of Christianity. This is Mencken, who himself was no Christian and, in fact, as much of a critic of Christianity as Nietzsche. And what he said in the preface of his translation of the Antichrist is what he, Nietzsche, flung himself against from beginning to end was always, in the last analysis, Christianity in some form or other. Christianity is a system of ethics, political code, metaphysics, or Christianity is a gauge of the truth. It would be difficult to think of any intellectual enterprise on his long list that did not, more or less, directly and clearly, relate itself to this master enterprise of them all. So I'm really not overstating here when I push back this hard against Nietzsche, for Nietzsche himself is an open and declared enemy of the faith in a way that's to uh, hard to ignore. Next slide. It was as if, Mencken continues, his apostasy from the faith of his fathers had blinded him to every other element in the gigantic self delusion of civilized man. The will to power was his answer to Christianity's affectation of humility and self sacrifice. Eternal recurrence was his mocking criticism of Christian optimism and millennialism. The Superman was Nietzsche's candidate for the place of the Christian ideal of the good man, prudently abased before the throne of God. The things he chiefly argued for were anti Christian things, the abandonment of the purely moral view of life, the rehabilitation of instinct, the dethronedness of weakness and timidity as ideals, the renunciation of the whole hocus pocus of dogmatic religion, the extermination of false aristocracies, of the priest, of the politician, and the plutocrat. Next slide. Nietzsche was plainly a foe of democracy in all its forms, political, religious, and epistemological. And what is worse, his opposition was set forth in terms that were not only extraordinarily penetrating and devastating, but also uncommonly offensive. Now, this is Mencken saying this. This is not me saying this. Next slide. His plain aim in the Antichrist was to combat the menace by completing the work begun by Darwin and by, on the other hand, by German historians. The net effect of this attack had been the collapse of Christian theology as a serious concern of educated men. The mob, it must be obvious, was very little shaken. Even to this day, it has not put off its belief in the essential Christian doctrines. But the intelligentsia by 1885 had been pretty well convinced. Next slide. No man of sound information at the time Nietzsche planned the Antichrist actually believed that the world was created in 7 days, or that it was once overwhelmed by a flood as a penalty for the sins of man, or that Noah saved the boa constrictor, the prairie dog, or the pediculus capitis by taking a pair of each into the ark, or that Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt, or that a fragment of the true cross could cure hydrophobia. Such notions, still almost universally prevalent in Christendom a century before, were now confined to the great body of ignorant and credulous men. That is, to 95 or 96% of the race. For a man of the superior minority to subscribe to one of them publicly was already sufficient to set him off as one in imminent need of psychiatrical attention. Belief in them had become a mark of inferiority, like the Allied belief in madstones, magic, and apparitions. Next slide. Democracy and free speech are not facets of one gem. Democracy and free speech are eternal enemies. In any battle between an institution and an idea, the idea in the long run has the better of it. The majority of men prefer delusion to truth. It soothes. It is easy to grasp. Above all, it fits more snugly than the truth into a universe of false appearances. Next slide. Well, okay then. That's okay. I really hope that nothing I say further that is sharp or stark against Nietzsche can be seen as worse than what Mencken himself has said was the direct focus, the prime movement of Nietzsche's life. So I'm really hoping to avoid any charges that I'm overplaying my hand or overstating just how at odds Nietzsche was, and remains to Christianity. So traditional morality, in his view, is not objectively true, but only a vehicle of the will to power by which some people oppress others. So Nietzsche views himself and his moral stance in his philosophy that he is beyond good and evil. Now, interpreters are in a rough spot. Interpreters like to soften the statements of some of the philosophers whom they are interpreting. And they love to do things like say, what he means when he says, I hate you, is then offer an interpretation that blunts the obvious force of the language. He doesn't mean he hates you. He means that in the context of all the cultural heritage and the rich and continued tradition of the examination, the dialectic allows one to conclude a slight perturbation against. Now, that was me being facetious, but with Nietzsche, we're really not in a position to do that. And this is one of the things that's so difficult because with Bavinck, we want to take this charitable and generous approach, but we've found that Nietzsche has burned all bridges and leaves no options for such an approach. So he urges a transvaluation of all values, and we're going to talk more about what that is. And his reasoning is since God is dead as a factor in the lives of modern people, it is wrong for us to bind ourselves with moral traditions from the past. Next slide. Now, I said earlier that it is the spirit of Nietzsche that I perhaps encounter in the most I'm trying to think of the right word. The most hard-boiled, embittered, and distinctly antagonistic with no relenting. Um, you know, is what I have found it is to be with to talk with people who seem to have brought that Nietzschean spirit into their own philosophy and into their values and into their life. And so here's just an example. This is a comment on one of the Nietzsche videos on YouTube. I think it was uh, Jordan Peterson talking about Nietzsche. This was one of the comments from that video. And it is just a slice sort of right out of the Nietzschean book, so to speak. So FGFGFGFDRTDUUD says, stop projecting your Christian values into everything. It's not an objective view of reality. Drop all the should, could, would bull. Anyone who believes in doing good things is naive. Objective reality doesn't care that you're trying to lose weight or help your elderly neighbor. It just is, and it doesn't care at all. When you get run over by a truck and you lay there taking your last breath, you will realize this. Nihilists realize that from a Darwinian point of view, there is no inherent value. And so some people might say, well, why are we talking about this? This is just your average internet troll. And I would just put forward that this is really someone from the Nietzsche school of philosophy engaging. And this is very common among people who are influenced by these principles that we're talking about tonight. And so the first thing I want you to just notice here is look at the imperatives in this. Stop projecting. Drop all the could, should, would. Objective reality doesn't care about this. You know, you're going to find that out too when you get run over by a truck and lay there taking your last breath. There's this intense imperative antagonism to Nietzsche's writings that when people today apply that is completely consistent with his philosophy and his thought. Next slide. So, let's go back here. And these are not controversial statements at all. I'm not misquoting Nietzsche or misrepresenting him. This is just he couldn't be clearer if he tried. He saw himself and others who thought as he did as a member of a new race of human beings, the supermen, and is built upon a pride and a contempt for the previous race of humans, the herd. And so remember, Nietzsche writes this as one who leaves absolutely no room for the peaceful coexistence between Christianity and his supermen. And so he may have written insightful things about philosophy and human nature. And I'll say in a carefully qualified sense, he did. But he always wrote from a perspective of extreme and ultimate alienation to Christianity. Next slide. Here's here's a Reformed philosopher, John Frame, talking a little bit about Nietzsche, bringing a Christian perspective. And he compares and starts off here. I'll just read the quote. It is interesting to compare Nietzsche with Marx on the subject of Christianity. Marx thought Christianity was a religion of the rich aiming to suppress the poor. Nietzsche, however, saw it as a slave religion arising from the self-interest of the weak and oppressed, expressing their secret hatred and envy of those more favored. Nietzsche's view is nearly the opposite of that of Marx, which suggests that the moral relativism of both men may be unsuited to making any cogent moral observations. Next slide. Frame continues. The difference between Marx and Nietzsche is like the difference between the sophists, Thrasymachus and Callicles, on the subject of justice and law. Thrasymachus thought that justice is in the interest of the stronger, and Marx likewise taught that the strong classes of people use Christianity to keep workers in bondage. And as Callicles taught, the laws are a device by which the masses could check the power of the strong. So Nietzsche thought that Christianity was a slave religion bent on frustrating the ambitions of superior people. Both wanted Christianity to be abolished. They wanted Christianity to be replaced by an ideology either supporting class warfare, in the case of Marx, or of the supermen, i.e. Nietzsche. Next slide. Now, I'm just going to read a little bit of Nietzsche himself for you, and I want to just ask you to consider how his work speaks for itself, and how, in criticizing him in a way that seems relatively harsh here, I am in fact not being an unfaithful critic, but in fact perhaps I'm not going far enough, it could be arguably said. So this is the opening from Nietzsche's preface to the Antichrist. Listen to him speak. This book, the Antichrist, belongs to the most rare of men. Perhaps not one of them is yet alive. Is it possible that they may be among those who understand my Zarathustra? How could I confound myself with those who are now sprouting ears? First, the day after tomorrow must come for me. Some men are born posthumously. Some men are born posthumously. Notice the descent into irrationalism as a rhetorical device. Now, you will find Nietzschean interpreters massaging these statements and soothing them over and turning them into pablum. Well, what Nietzsche means when he says this is, and they'll say something that is just very palatable. And yet, it's clear Nietzsche is not intending to be palatable. Let's continue the next paragraph. The conditions under which anyone understands me, and necessarily understands me, I know them only too well. Even to endure my seriousness, my passion, he must carry intellectual integrity to the verge of hardness. He must be accustomed to living on mountaintops and to looking upon the wretched gabble of politics and nationalism as beneath him. He must have become indifferent. He must never ask of the truth, whether it brings profit to him or a fatality to him. Next slide. He must have an inclination born of strength for questions that no one has the courage for, the courage for the forbidden, predestination for the labyrinth, the experience of seven solitudes, new ears for new music, new eyes for what is most distant, a new conscience for truths that have hitherto remained unheard, and the will to economize in the grand manner, to hold together his strength, his enthusiasm, reverence for self, love of self, absolute freedom of self. Next slide. Very well, then, of that sort only are my readers, my true readers, my readers foreordained. Of what account are the rest? They are merely humanity. One must make one's self superior to humanity in power, in loftiness of soul, in contempt. Next slide. So here Nietzsche is describing that his words are to be read in the light of a certain spirit. And he's describing a hardening of resolve and will, similar in its opposition to the teleos or purposes of the Christian God in the scriptures. He is a modern Pharaoh or hardened soul. Now, after his mental breakdown, which occurred, I believe, in 1889, the depth of his intended enmity becomes even more explicit. He signed some letters with Dionysius, and others he signed as the crucified one. Additionally, he commanded the German emperor to go to Rome to be shot and summoned the European powers to take military action against Germany, that the Pope should be put in jail, and that he, Nietzsche, created the world and was in the process of having all anti-Semites shot dead. Next slide. Although most commentators regard his breakdown as unrelated to his philosophy, Georges Bataille dropped dark hints. Man incarnate must also go mad. And René Girard's post-mortem psychoanalysis posits a worshipful rivalry with Richard Wagner. Nietzsche had previously written, all superior men who were irresistibly drawn to throw off the yoke of any kind of morality, and to frame new laws had, if they were not actually mad, no alternative but to make themselves or pretend to be mad. After his death, his friend and secretary gave his funeral oration, proclaiming, "Holy be your name to all future generations." Holy be your name to all future generations. This is profanity on a scale that's hard to even conceive of, let alone criticize amiably. Next slide. So Nietzsche, in one sense, has put himself in his thought as the ultimate antithesis to the Christian thesis. And I'm going to make an arguable case that the Western secular world, the post Enlightenment secular world of today and of the past century, synthesizes both Nietzsche and Christianity in a profane way. And by synthesize, I mean enjoy the blessings and benefits of God and the productivity of God's people and societies, while yet rejecting him and warring against his partisans. So I talked with one of my dear, close atheist friends, and I asked him one time, why do you observe or celebrate Christian holidays when you don't serve the God who gave them? And what I found with him and what I found with most atheists is that they'll take the holidays, thank you, but not the God that gave them. Biting the hand that feeds it is one slogan that seems to come up. Next slide. And so we see even recently movements such as the New Atheism, which is this sort of patricidal, intense, and anti-theism birthed from the pre-Enlightenment Christian West. And so basically, it's this sort of Darwinian ascent of man turned cancerous and aggressive. And Nietzsche writes in his book, if you don't understand or recognize the truth and power of his writings, it's your own fault. Philosophy is not the handmaid or the servant of theology, but it is philosophy that bites back. So Nietzsche has brought a hubris into philosophy, an academic study that, if present earlier, was at least recognized as a fault and not a virtue. So we've always had issues with ivory tower and academics, but even and at least it was recognized prior to Nietzsche that to be this aggressive and to be this harsh in one's ivory towerness was not a virtue. However, Nietzsche has inverted the system, and now the fault is a virtue. And I think of, this reminds me of college Christians and Nietzsche and my own growing up as a young boy in the 1970s. So I've told this already to one of my friends on the call here, but I'll just say it again briefly. I went in my 30s. I went to a Bible study on a college campus, very famous college campus. If I said it, it'd be very well known, very esteemed one. And in the Bible study, I met these fresh-faced freshmen men and women, who were so happy to be at university studying. And in that first semester, the faith that they had brought from home was fresh in their minds, and esteem for the scriptures was high. And then I stayed a second semester, and in the second semester, I saw that faith grow cold and I saw it grow dim. And by the third semester, I saw them openly rejecting the Bible. All of them were sexually active, and the big exciting thing in our Bible study was next semester we get to read Nietzsche. And so there is a real spirit behind this. And further, I grew up in the 1970s in an intensely philosophical household or circle that I ran in, where philosophy was highly valued. And of course, I was a boy and I didn't know any of these concepts. And so I was ignorant of them, but I kept bumping into them throughout this time of life. And it's only later that I found out it was German idealism and it was Nietzsche. And what a terrible spirit that it inculcated in those circles. Next slide. Now, Bavinck is going to indict this, and we've already looked at part of this quote earlier, but in respect to Nietzsche, Bavinck's indictment seems good to come back and check with. So, against the perspectivalism of Nietzsche, and this self-love and this self-generation and the presuppositionless of German idealism. Bavinck rejects that and notes that you can't do study and research using this. If presuppositionlessness is one's aim and one takes a positivistic approach to religion, the inevitable result is a theology of mood in place of concepts, a system of paradox in place of sober truth, the art of being enthused about everything in place of the conviction which looks for a fixed standard of things. The purely empirical method results in surrender to the relativism of the historical process and the loss of one's ability to judge the truth content of a religion. I'm going to read that again. The loss of one's ability to judge the truth content of a religion. Wow. It also results in the tendency to judge religious phenomena purely aesthetically in terms of their beauty. So, as Nietzsche did with Nero and Caesar Borgia, one goes into raptures over ecstatics and fanatics as the religious showpieces of humanity. Next slide. It also must be said that such consistent relativism, which is synonymous with the total indifferentism, is certainly not the intent of the advocates of the history of religions and psychological method. It is their aim, by use of this method, to arrive at a dogmatics based not on abstract ideas, but on facts. But it is not hard to demonstrate that the path chosen does not and cannot lead to this goal. Let scholars show historically and psychologically something they're not now or probably will never be able to do, how religion originates, grows, develops, and falls into decay. Let them also prove statistically that religion is a cultural power of the first rank and will probably remain so in the future. How can they ever deduce from all this that religion is based on truth, that an invisible reality underlies it? Next slide. Anyone who has not acquired this conviction by another route will certainly not get it by way of the history of religions and psychological method. Let me pause here. Enlightenment thinkers proposed, in some softer senses, those who were not overtly secular or atheistic, those who were theistic had this idea that if we just start from neutral ground, if we just start reasoning from facts in hand and our empirical phenomenological method, we're going to somehow re-arrive at the truth of Christianity. And Bavinck here says that that's a fool's errand. One arrives at metaphysics, at a philosophy of religion, only if from another source one has gained the certainty that religion is not just an interesting phenomenon, but it, in fact, is the truth that God exists and reveals himself and is knowable. One who believes in a philosophy of religion may assume the appearance of being totally unbiased in the study of religions, but that appearance is false. He does not proceed from a fact that is recognized as certain. He assumes a priori, without investigation, that religion is a normal, not a pathological phenomenon, and that it has its warrant in the existence and self-revelation of God. Next slide. One more slide here of Bavinck. This fundamentally deprives those philosophers of religion of every right to look down disparagingly from the heights of their scientific impartiality on those who proceed from the premise that Christianity is the true religion, and that it should serve as the standard in the study of different religions. These philosophers of religion proceed no less certainly than the latter from an unproven presupposition that they have accepted a priori in faith, namely, the telling presupposition that God exists, that he can be known, and consequently that religion is based on truth. Over against the consistent empiricists and positivists, they have as much right to defend this premise as those who proceed from the truth of Christianity. Their supposition is more vague and general than that of the latter, but it bears the same character and is of the same kind. So a great summary here is that Bavinck notes that the whole crux of the Enlightenment edifice in terms of its criticisms of pre-Enlightenment dogmas is in fact incorrect. It turns out that the Enlightenment thinkers are just as dogmatic as the dogmatists they crowed so loudly against. And in fact, they are just merely dogmatic about different things. And so we see that here in the thought of Nietzsche, perhaps Nietzsche as the culmination, the thought leader of Enlightenment thinking. Next slide. Now, here we're just going to go into some quotes from Nietzsche, and these are going to be so negative against him that it might seem like there is no positive value in studying Nietzsche, or that he actually brings no insight at all and everything he says is false. I think there's a case that he's fundamentally flawed. But I also want to point out that, Gordon Clark, Calvinist theologian, said that I don't hate strawberries just because the devil says they taste good. And so let's look through Nietzsche as professional apologists and believers. But let's just always remember and not minimize what seems to happen so often today when these interpreters sort of make Nietzsche very palatable. And so we're going to go through some quotes that are some of the most difficult to reconcile with Christianity. And this doesn't mean that he might not have insights in other areas, but we really need to bring this out. And so the first thing is in Nietzsche, we see the priesthood of the psychologist and the replacement of Christianity with this newer Enlightenment inner light. In Christianity, the priest represents the people before God. And yet in this new enlightened state, the people, Nietzsche believes, have killed God, that is, moved beyond him. And now the psychologist fills a sacred role. And of course, just like Kant said, prior to me, no one did metaphysics, Nietzsche said in his work Ecce Homo, that a psychologist without equal speaks from my writings. This is perhaps the first insight gained by a good reader. So there were no psychologists, there were no people exploring the inner human landscape prior to Nietzsche. Just like Kant said, there were no metaphysicians prior to him. Are we getting the trend here? There's something about the Enlightenment that seems to inculcate this aggressive, cancerous hubris and pride. Next slide. Nietzsche thus assigns himself a truly high status among the brights, and one is caught between having to decide if Nietzsche saw himself as a messiah or merely as a paterfamilias, or a head of a family. Like Kant, we mentioned before him, who essays that no one had really performed metaphysics before him, so too Nietzsche minimalizes comfortably all inquiry done by humankind prior to his own investigation. In other words, he seems to have a God complex. He says, who among the philosophers before me was in any way a psychologist? Before me, there was simply no psychology. Next slide. So now we come to the ultimate idea in Nietzsche's thought, this idea of becoming, the battle to become what one is. What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are. Now, Nietzsche here will talk more about integrating passions, following the instincts of the past, but as we will see, there's not an external God to which one answers. Rather, one is one's own sculptor or painter of one's own being. Next slide. All psychology so far has hung up on moral prejudices and fears and has not dared to descend into the depths. So nobody before Nietzsche had the ability to think in the ways that Nietzsche is thinking. Next slide. How can the human being know itself? It is a thing dark and veiled, and if the hair has 7 skins, the human can slough off 70 times 7 and still not be able to say, now that is what you really are. That is no longer your outer shell. Now, I want to really point this out because if you remember, the whole point of the Kantian enterprise was Kant thought that we could think about thinking. In other words, people could open up the contents of their minds and examine those contents truthfully, as if we were just opening up a refrigerator. And Nietzsche says here what I think Christians, mature Christians, have said forever. Who can understand the depths of the human mind? And of course, from the Bible, we have the revelation that in the final analysis, the human mind is not only hard to understand, but it is deceitful and wicked. Who can know it, is the statement. So that contrasts with what Nietzsche says here. Next slide. I undertook something that not everyone may undertake. I descended into the depths. I bored into the foundations. Next slide. He enters a labyrinth and multiplies 1,000-fold the dangers that life in itself brings with it, of which not the least is that nobody can see how and where he loses his way and is torn to pieces by some cave minotaur of conscience. Living the life is a lot harder than the optimistic early German idealists originally thought. Nietzsche's anthropology is reflecting something much more complex and something much closer than to the traditional Christian Orthodox doctrine of total depravity, although not the same thing. But where Kant and other phenomenologists just blasé think we can view our own thoughts and understand our own selves, Nietzsche reflects like the Bible that that's not nearly so innocent or obvious as one might naively assume. Next slide. As humans, we cannot, as some falsely claim, be fashioned in any way we please to create oneself. Each of us, according to Nietzsche, has a deep and abiding nature which places a definite set limits on who and what we can become. Well, hello, thank you. When one rejects the totality of pre-Enlightenment Christian thinking and declares that one is sailing in waters no one has ever previously sailed in, it is surely a surprise to this Christian that Nietzsche here discovers, in the manner of a Christopher Columbus, something already known by Christian theologians for millennia, namely, humankind is a creature of nature. And it's not just pre-Enlightenment Christian thinkers who had figured this out. Now, my point here is not to mock Kant or Nietzsche, but do we not see that there is a mania of enlightenment hubris and ego in these thinkers? This claim that they are going where no one has ever gone before, they're the first, they're reinventing, that everything else that came before, this is nothing. And yet, then when they go down these paths and conclude something similar to what other people have said in the past, is the irony of that not lost on people? Next slide. Okay, here's a quote. At the bottom of us, really deep down, there is something unteachable, some granite of spiritual fatum, a personal fate or destiny, of predetermined decision and answer to predetermined selected questions. Whenever a cardinal problem is at stake, there speaks an unchangeable, this is I. So reality is moving. The personal fate. He wants to affirm destiny and teleos, an ultimate meaning, even as he denies it. We have to, at some point, say that Nietzsche is stepping out into the irrational. By contrast, we could, two verses that came to mind that really are much clearer. First of all, 2 Corinthians 5:10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive his due for the things done in the body, whether good or bad. So Christians are affirming that there is a final purpose, a final destination for humankind. 2 Samuel says, for surely we will die and be like water poured out on the ground, which cannot be recovered. Yet God does not take away a life, but he devises ways so that the banished one may not remain estranged from him. Next slide. Nietzsche here says the past of every form and way of life, of cultures that formerly lay right next to or on top of each other, now flows into our modern souls. Our drives now run back everywhere. We ourselves are a kind of chaos. Everyone must die once, Nietzsche, and after that, be judged by God. And the Christian hope is this, 1 John. In this way, love has been perfected among us, so that we may have confidence on the day of judgment. So while not denying Nietzsche's point, we ourselves are a kind of chaos. The whole Christian gospel is about recognizing and accepting that this chaos exists, but that a being outside of this chaos has reached down and personally affected our future destinies, so that in spite of this chaos, we will have a good and wholesome end. Next slide. The beast within, Nietzsche notes the potentially destructive inclinations which can overtake and possess the human being, such as the drive to aggression and unbridled sexual lust. Really? Really, Nietzsche? I, I mean, is he the first person in all of human history to notice these things? I'm really trying to not be sarcastic here, but there is a level of uncleanness here that is very difficult to deal with. So the Christian response is, who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean thing? No one can. This uncleanness is pervasive. Romans 7 says it this way: For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. Is Nietzsche really the first person to look inside the human soul and find a beast? Next slide. He says here, the organizing idea that is destined to rule keeps growing back down, begins to command. Slowly it leads us back from side roads and wrong roads. It prepares single qualities and fitnesses that will one day prove to be indispensable as means toward a whole. One by one, it trains all subservient capacities before giving any hint of the dominant task, goal, aim, or meaning. So Nietzsche has rejected the external narrative of Christianity, but has replaced it with an overarching, integrated whole. This idea that all human passions will be integrated under this subservient capacity and move toward this ultimate dominant task, this will to power, this goal, this aim or meaning. Next slide. It is a myth to believe that we will find our authentic self after we have left behind or forgotten one thing or another. To make ourselves, here it is, to take a shape from various elements, that is the task of a sculptor, of a productive human being. So here it is. Nietzsche has replaced, take the view that God gave in the Old Testament of Israel. Jeremiah went to the potter's house, and God said, am I not like this potter? And Israel, are you not like clay? Can I not make with you as I please? And here Nietzsche puts himself in the potter's wheel of his own self. He is his own sculptor, not God. Next slide. And finally, I apologize. This is a little hard to read. You can go to the Wikipedia article on here, but I just want to add one postscript that is very ugly to add, but I wouldn't add it if it were not true. There is a thesis to be made, an arguable point, that Nietzsche is perhaps the single most important contributor to the philosophical underpinnings of the Third Reich. And so, while Nietzsche was alive, many of his works, including the Antichrist, were not published because of their the extremity of their statements. And further, after he died, his sister, who's shown here, Elizabeth, reworked his unpublished writings to fit her own ideology, which were often contrary to her own brother's opinions. And that's a really generous way of saying she really toned down a lot of his anti-Christian rhetoric. And through Foster's Nietzsche's editions, Nietzsche became associated with National Socialism and German militarism, the Nazi Party, the Third Reich. Later in life, she became a member of the Nazi Party, and when she died in 1935, Adolf Hitler attended her funeral. Boy, that's not something your college professors are talking about too much today. And one of the contemporary scholarly responses is that, oh, Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth, corrupted his work. And it was those corrupted works that formed the philosophical underpinnings of the Third Reich, not Nietzsche's opinions. Well, this is really contentious because the sister actually made things much more palatable by toning down the aggressive anti Christian rhetoric. So Nietzsche was actually less strident in her edited writings of his than he was originally. And so here we are. I've tried to be charitable. I've tried to be honorable. I've tried to honor the work of somebody who at times has insights. And yet at the same point in time, we have before us one of the worst villains who has ever lived, Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you, Enlightenment. Okay, that gets us to the question and answer session. And I apologize for going over here a little bit. Thank you for your patience. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I think it's not really a question. I particularly liked the section you brought up about the Marx and Nietzsche, the extension of their thinking, that Nietzsche's Superman and Marx's you know, philosophy supporting class warfare. I found that pretty interesting how those two came from the same root, shall we say, and had a different extension into the self-made Superman and the uh, class warfaring Marxist ideology.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will note, and please hear me carefully here, and let me speak this carefully. I am not saying that Superman, the comic character Superman, was in any way based on Nietzsche here or his philosophy. I'm saying the opposite. um, the character of Superman um, was a response to the German nationalism of the 1930s. Superman's creators were Jewish, and they were concerned with not necessarily Nietzsche himself or directly, but with where portions of his philosophy went in terms of the integration with the Third Reich. And so, this idea of the Ubermensch or the Superman is easy to misunderstand, and I hope I'm careful here, but it's very stark, and I wish I had even a little bit more time because one of the sessions, one of the videos, they're all three of them are extremely worth watching. The third video on there, which was Nietzsche and the morality of the herd, is absolutely atrocious and abominable in terms of how elitist he thought of himself and his fellow brights, almost almost like a new species of humankind, and that's that was very striking to me when I came across that. And there you have it. My apologies. Much of the question and answer session for this particular lecture was cut off. We had some technical difficulties, so my apologies there. We did not get all the good questions and comments like we usually want to, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for taking a look with us at this most fascinating figure in Enlightenment psychology and philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche. For the Philosopher's Clearinghouse, this is Romans 9:18.